Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is David Gabor. I'm a partner with the Wagner Law Group, and I am the chair of the Employment Law and the Human Resources team. One of the goals at the Wagner Law Group is to provide timely and critical information to our clients, our friends, and our colleagues. Today, I'm especially honored to be joined by three industry leaders who will help further that mission. They all bring a great deal of knowledge and information to the table. I'm going to introduce my colleagues in the order in which they will be presenting. First, we have Amanda Scott. Amanda is the president and founder of Solution Harbor, where she places management to executive level employees with her clients. Her practice is national. Amanda has a proven method that leads to a long-lasting placement. Remarkably, she has never had to utilize her replacement guarantee during her nearly 20-year career. Amanda also offers contract recruiting, candidate and transition coaching, and outplacement service for companies. Recruiting is a deeply personal and important process for any business as well as employee, and Amanda really cares about the human aspects of her profession. Amanda, thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here, David.
Thank you. Next, I would like to introduce LeiLani Quiray. She has a fiery passion for both human resources and philanthropy. She applies her experience and wisdom derived from 20 years of human resources experience in multiple industries and her philanthropic work to build a business that is different from your everyday human resources consulting firm. Be the Change HR. A conscious company and social enterprise provides fractional HR executive support, strategy, and service to businesses in any facet of HR from pre-hire to post-term and everything else that happens in between. Quote, be the change you wish to see in the world, close quote, from Gandhi. Yup, she's doing just that. Hello, LeiLani.
Thank you for having me. Stoked to be here.
Thank you. And next we've got Gretchen Nedzi. She's an executive coach who supports both individuals in transition and corporations. She helps clients find deeper insight and understanding, which allows them to take meaningful action where they have previously been stuck. She has the unique ability to help her clients clarify and achieve their definition of success. She applies her more than 15 years of experience in corporate America, including leadership roles in Fortune 100 companies and tremendous interpersonal skills to her coaching. In addition, Gretchen is an experienced certified instructor as well as an affiliate and mentor coach with Accomplishment Coaching. Hello, Gretchen.
Hello. So happy to be here, David.
Thank you so much. And Amanda, please kick this off.
All right, thanks so much. So obviously we've got a lot of different things at play in our society and world right now. And so certainly that's affecting recruiting. We're all seeing in the news that there's millions upon millions of people filing for unemployment and that companies are having to lay folks off. And so one would assume that recruiting in an environment like this would be easier because more people are unemployed or underemployed and perhaps would be open to a new opportunity. Certainly in the past when the economy has been not quite as strong as we've seen over the last few years, recruiting has been easier. If candidates are either not employed or they're employed but underemployed, and what I mean by that is they're working at a company but they're, maybe their pay is low, maybe they're working more overtime than they'd like, maybe their organization is strapped thin for talent. So in those types of situations, people tend to be more open to new opportunities. I think if you're recruiting for labor type professions or other sort of hourly employees, it's probably pretty easy to recruit right now. However, when you're recruiting educated, management up to C-level, I think most of these people actually are still employed. I think many of them have been working from home due to the pandemic. And so I, as a recruiter, have been working on a handful of searches during the past few months, and I've found it's extremely difficult to recruit. It was very shocking to me. I figured that I would have a lot more opportunity to connect with passive candidates who might be open to new opportunities. Some of the reasons that I think this market is difficult to recruit out of is fear. I think that candidates are in fear of the pandemic. I think there's a lot of this, legacy of racism in our world and specifically in our country. And there's fear of how that situation would be handled at a new employer. I think there's fear of how the pandemic has been handled at a new employer. And so when people are afraid, they know what they have. If they're employed, they know what they have at their current company. And so that might kind of freeze them from making any decisions about being recruited to a new opportunity. Next slide, please. David, may I have my next slide? All right, so what can we do to get around this issue of how do we get past the fear and try to recruit really A-player type of candidates? So I think, again, for management to C-level candidates, you're still going to need to do active recruiting. Passive recruiting, posting a job online is not going to be enough. So at your company, you either need an internal recruiting resource that is recruiting passive candidates, or you can use a recruiter like me or someone else that's trusted in your group of resources to do proactive recruiting. Before you begin recruiting for any position, you really should think about the selling points of your organization. Why would someone want to work for you? Now, this is always important, whether we're in a good or bad economy, pandemic or not. You should be thinking about the selling points of your company. So that could be everything from great work-life balance to a great product that's doing something great for the world to we have really good health insurance. Right now, I think the most important, I shouldn't say the most important, I think it's very important, always, but right now especially, to be able to discuss how your company handles diversity and how your company has handled the pandemic. I just placed a controller with a small family-owned business, and the company's manufacturing, they've done very well at continuing to run their company with active social distancing in place. And I think everyone there feels very safe with how the company has set things up. Every single candidate I interviewed for that job had questions about how did this company handle it? Were they working from home? What's happening on the manufacturing floor? So you want to be thinking about what you've done to handle this pandemic issue and talk about that in a positive way when you go to recruit candidates. As far as handling diversity, we're obviously, racism is in the news every day right now. It's definitely a difficult situation for everyone in our country. And so I think it's very important to discuss how your company handles diversity. Do you have, a great employment attorney like David who's teaching your employees how to avoid harassment or discrimination? How do you make sure you're being inclusive of a variety of different cultures and races? How does your company avoid separation? How does your company really envelop or include a variety of different people and talk about that as a selling point? Okay, David, next slide, please. So I also always recommend to any company to put together an interview format prior to starting the process. So now, depending on what state you're in, you have different, and even within your state and within different counties, there's different social distancing rules at play. So, you may have to do interviews over the phone or Zoom. I've had my client was controller position. The final interviews, I actually met for coffee outside at a park. So, I mean, you're going to have to be creative with whatever you're comfortable with within the guidelines of whatever regulations are happening. But whatever you do, set up the interview process and make it consistent before you start recruiting. Anytime you're doing any kind of interviewing, you want to have the same interview process across all candidates, because you can sort of prevent bias and make sure that you give everyone a fair shake. Once you make a hiring decision, say you interview 4 candidates, you make a hiring decision, candidate A is the one that you hire, candidate B was someone from a protected class and comes back and says, you know, you didn't hire me because I'm from this protected class. You can say, no, look at our notes. We gave all 4 of these candidates the same 3 types of interviews, and we found that candidate A was the most qualified. So you can make a fair decision, but you can also prevent yourself from litigation down the road after making a hiring decision. You also always want to include at least 2 people in an interview process. Everyone has biases, whether we know it or not. You know, it could be something as subtle as a candidate likes a different football team than you do. So if you can have someone else be involved in the interview process, you can prevent choosing someone based on your positive or negative biases. Next slide, please. So another area to consider is layoffs. When you are, if your company is unfortunately involved in having to lay folks off, there's certainly things that you can do to make that a bit nicer. One of the things that you can offer your employees that you're laying off is outplacement services. So I offer those types of services where a company can engage with me for however much they have the budget for. You know, it could be as few as 2 hours, I would say as most as 4 hours, to work with those employees on improving their resume, their LinkedIn profile, and their interview skills. So they're walking out into the world set up to get a good next opportunity. Something really important also about layoffs is you want to communicate to the employees that stay. I mean, retention is key, and in order to keep the employees that are staying with you, that are not being laid off, you want to make sure it's really clear and communicated to them what you've done to help the employees that are laid off, why the employees were laid off. It's much better to keep them informed than in the dark. All right, next slide, please. So the last thing I want to touch on is reputation and how communication can affect your reputation. One of my mentors early in my career told me, every candidate you work with is a walking billboard. And so what that means is how I, as a recruiter, treat each candidate that I interact with, that is a memory that is created. And that candidate can go out in the world and tell everyone either Amanda Scott is a great, nice, kind recruiter, or Amanda Scott is a horrible person and I never would work with her. You know, that was nearly 20 years ago when I had my mentor tell me that. And we didn't have all this social media stuff and internet outlets where people can post things like they can today. So anytime you're dealing with a past, present, or potential employee, you want to treat them as customers. You want their experience, no matter how brief, to be positive with your company. Because if it's negative, you can be sure they're going to tell their neighbors, they're going to post about it on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or Glassdoor or one of a million different outlets that they can post on to say good or bad things about your company. Negative things are remembered more than positive. So each and every past, present, and potential candidate or employee should be treated as a customer. Treat them kindly, fairly. You know, you want them to go out in the world and say, that was a great company, I'm glad I worked there. That was a great company, I'm glad I got to interview, and I'm disappointed I didn't get the job. Whatever the case, you want those folks to go out in the world and say great things about your company. All right, I think that's it from me, and so I think it's time for LeiLani.
Thank you, Amanda. Amazing information. And when you were talking about coffee in the park, I don't know about you all, but I haven't been out a whole lot, so coffee in the park for an interview sounds so delightful right now. LeiLani here from Be the Change HR. I'll be talking about your people. So there's much debate and confusion for non-essential workers who don't have to go back to work right now, but they can. And so it's time to go back to work, or is it? Next slide. Now, some people might be at home with 4 kids, 2 dogs, a spouse, and sharing a kitchen table with all of them to do work and school. And they might be screaming like, get me the heck out of here. I don't want to be working from home anymore. But you might have individuals who enjoy working from home. And for those thinking forward, it could be a company benefit that you provide to people, you provide to your high performers. It's something that you could have as a positive company culture of trust, because if you trust your employees, then you'll know they'll do the right thing and they'll be productive at home. Of course, if you have people working from home, you'll want a telecom or telecommunication agreement, has guidelines on work from home in place, things like they'll be safe and whatnot. Hire an attorney like David in order to get those in place for you. Another thing to consider if you have people continuing to work from home is that butts in seats from 9 to 5 doesn't equal like productivity, right? We've all been working at home for a while. We know the interruptions. I don't know about you. I'm getting Instacart delivered to the door in the middle of a meeting, and I'm like excusing myself. So they might, it might not be a 9 to 5 always in the seat, but they could possibly be working earlier or later. So consider that. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to be in those hours. And they might have, more interruptions than they would at work, although we do know we've got chatty coworkers, so we could have people interrupting us more at work than at home. And then, of course, in any organization, you'll always want to track goals and performance. That's how you keep accountability with your team. So your employees might not want to come back because they are at high risk, right? So we've got people who have medical conditions, maybe a household member with a medical condition. They might have little kids at home or aging parents. So you want to keep that into consideration. We might not know the situation of every single person in their home life and why they may or may not be at high risk. And in these high risk situations, I want to caution you on ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. Make sure that you're not discriminating due to a disability. And finally, another little warning, of course, this is HR here, work comp claims. So in some states like California, it is assumed that if someone contracts COVID, that they got it at work. So you want to make sure that you keep that in consideration too when keeping your employees safe. And then finally, they might not want to come back because they're just plain scared. COVID-19 is scary. I mean, I was out the other day just looking around and people are in masks and gloves. People are spraying sanitizer all over their hands. It's not like a normal environment we are in right now. And then you think about the media and the news, it doesn't make it any easier. So they might just be scared. They might be uncertain about employer precautionary measures. They might be uncertain about their coworkers too. Are they going to take precautionary measures? Next slide, please. So what do? We ask our teams. We ask them about how they feel about returning to work. Next slide. So we've developed a survey. We're calling it the Taking Employee Temps Survey, pun intended. We want to identify if they want to return to work, why they do not want to return to work, and what the company can do in order to have them feeling more comfortable about returning to work. And we have some sample questions for you. Next slide. So this is my team we're looking at. So I'm showing you my organization. We ask 6 multiple choice questions and 6 open-ended questions. It is completely anonymous, and we'll review what to do with these later. But here's the first question. I'm ready and available to return to work on site. You can see there that, a third agree, a third aren't sure, and the other third, they disagree. They're not ready and available to return to work on site. Next question is, I am nervous about returning to work on site and would prefer not to return until there are more safety precautions in place. So the majority agree, and we take this information and we work it into a plan. Next slide. Here's an example of an open-ended question. What is your biggest concern about returning to work on site, right? So read the first. My biggest concern would be whether clients are taking safety precautions when we meet with them. So we have consultants, they go into other people's workplaces. So this gives employees an opportunity to voice their concerns in their own words. It's good feel of how the employees are feeling. And then I'd like to offer to you all, if you'd like to utilize this survey, it's something that I'll be giving to you for free for joining today. You'll see my contact information at the end. But if this is helpful for you, it is all yours. Next slide. So what do we do with this information? We prepare, we communicate, and we execute. And we do this in cycles. We do this more than once. Next slide. So when we prepare, what we're going to do, and we'll take a look at those questions again, is analyze the results and then identify the gaps. So in our sample survey results, the team is split on wanting to return to work. Next slide, please. So here it is again. I'm ready and available to return to work on site. So the team is split on wanting to return to work. So we need to evaluate in this given situation if work from home can be a permanent solution. That is possible, right? We've been working from home, we're virtual, maybe that's possible. And then in this situation, since we have some that are unsure, or some that are ready to return to work, we can ask the team now openly, hey, would anybody like to be in the office? Would anybody like to be client-facing? Next slide. And then in this data, I am nervous about returning to work on site and would prefer not to return to work. So you can see here the team is concerned about safety precautions. We need to identify what precautions are being taken, what needs to be done, and then request action plans from our clients, or, well, we're HR, so we can offer to execute that for them. And then personally check prior to staff entering the workplace to ensure safety. So I could go out and do a safety check to make sure that that workplace is following their plan and their checklists. Next slide. So what do we do with all this information? We communicate. So you want to meet with your team. You want to discuss the plan with them. Have an open forum to talk about concerns that they have with the plan you have, anything they want to voice, and then address those concerns. And once you're finished, you want to write a written plan and send that written plan. Of course, you're going to want to revise as needed. So there's going to be changes in the overall COVID-19 environment. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so you want to stay on top of that. Changes to best practices, and of course, as we all know, there'll be changes to the laws. So you'll want to revise as needed. And then keep a checklist of to-dos that you need to do on a daily basis as far as the office is concerned, maybe weekly, so that you keep a running tab of what you're going to be doing in order to keep your workplace safe and keep your employees comfortable about coming into work. Next slide. And then you're going to execute. So follow your plan, of course, do your checklist. And then I encourage you to do town hall meetings weekly. So continue to communicate expectations, precautionary measures, your execution of the plan, listen to employees, let them voice their concerns, and then, execute on that as needed. Again, we want our employees to feel comfortable and safe at work in this environment. Next slide. And then I want to talk a little bit about leadership. And we are all in a tough role given all the current things going on in the world right now. Next slide. I wanted to give you this quote by Brene Brown. Is there anyone that does not need to navigate uncertainty and risk on a regular basis? To be alive is to be vulnerable. To be a leader is to be vulnerable every minute of the day. And that can't be more true than right now. Next slide. So I'm gonna leave you with this. We have a lot going on in the world today: COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, unrest, anxiety. We have murder hornets. So we've got a lot going on, and your employees are feeling this too. So I encourage you to really, really listen to your people, to be honest, to be transparent with them, and to be vulnerable. I encourage you as leaders to be vulnerable yourselves. I can tell you from personal experience, your team will trust you even more if you're open and honest and you have these open conversations, not just about COVID-19, but about everything that's going on in the world today. Make a safe, comfortable environment for them to do so, and they will thank you for it. And with that, I hand this over to Gretchen.
Thank you, LeiLani.
You're welcome.
Well, why are we making such a big deal about effective communication? Why is it so important? Well, first of all, it creates a positive workplace, and that begins with the collaborative foundation. When we encourage people to ask questions and voice their opinions, it helps them feel empowered, It increases collaboration, and it gives them a sense of community, which ultimately contributes to the group's success. And this results in a stronger team that's happy and eager to work together. Also, by communicating effectively, we can better understand our employees' skills, their experience, their talents, which all makes it easier for us to provide clear directions and assign tasks to team members with the most appropriate skills. And when teams collaborate better, they experience fewer mistakes, which increases productivity and profit. So when employees feel they can communicate their ideas and opinions openly without fear of ridicule, they're far less likely, or far more likely, not less, to bring new ideas to the table. And sharing ideas and opening up channels of communication leads to more innovation and ultimately increased work productivity and output and reduced errors, which all improve our bottom line. So next slide. How do we do that? We know that we want effective communication. Well, the number one way is to start with our own communication. And I'm sorry to say that while most of us think we're great communicators, most employees say their leaders lack communication skills. So we should continuously upgrade and work on our own communication skills. And let's continue with the top 10 ways to do this. The second way is to ask for and give feedback. Now, maybe you engage someone like LeiLani to do this, but however you do it, feedback is critical for driving employee engagement and their productivity and their retention. Without feedback, employees can become actively disengaged. Actively seeking out constructive feedback is one of the best ways to improve communication. So for those of us that are having one-on-ones, when you're done at the end, ask each other if there's any additional feedback to give, because there's usually something else there, and often that's the biggest jewel. Some of it might be positive. Oh, hey, I enjoyed seeing your work ethic this week when you were confronted with several obstacles. And some of it might be more, let's call it constructive. I noticed you expressed frustration during our brainstorming meeting this week. But whatever it is, those moments of feedback are an opportunity to really get to the heart of the matter. Also, if you tell an employee that they did a great job, that isn't particularly helpful because they might be left thinking, well, what was great about it, or how can I replicate it if I don't know? So be specific. Something like, you did a great job explaining how leads convert into customers in that presentation. The visuals really help the audience understand the process. Also, being specific gives our statement credibility, so people know our observations are sincere. The third strategy is to communicate our business strategy. More than 2/3 of employees don't have a full understanding of their company's strategy. I love the story of two workers that are out chiseling rock, and one of them is slow and sloppy and bored, and the other one is going to town. He's chiseling like mad. He's precise. He's energetic. He's fast. And when asked what they're doing, the first employee says, I'm chiseling rock. And the other one says, I'm building a monument. So our goals are probably more complex than that, but being in the know about what is going on in their company is one of the top things that employees want in a job, and it doesn't cost us anything. So companies are achieved when employees understand and align with our strategy and see how their work fits in. The next one, LeiLani touched on trust. Workplace communication has a direct impact on employees' trust towards their leaders. 93% of workers say trustworthy leadership was the most critical factor in creating alignment. So while 93% say it's important, just 61% feel that their companies are aligned with their values. Employees working at companies that cultivate trust feel 74% less stressed, are 106% more energetic at work, are 50% more productive, are 13% less willing to call in sick, feel 76% more engaged, and report a 29% higher satisfaction with their overall lives. Another strategy is to consider more phone or in-person conversations. Electronic communications can have a detrimental effect on any type of relationship. You know, how many times have we sent an email that somehow got misunderstood or misconstrued? Even when we have good intentions, electronic communication can be misinterpreted. And since the majority of meaning during a conversation comes from tone and nonverbal gestures and facial expressions, sometimes pick up the phone or pay a visit when you have something important to say. Also, emails and texts are not the right place for negative news. And many of us right now are currently separated by distance, but that is not an excuse for poor communication. Next slide, please. So listening is an important communication skill that many of us don't possess. Most conflict is a result of poor listening. In order to share information with another person, we have to hear what's being communicated. And if we're thinking about our next meeting or planning our dinner or whatever during the conversation, we are not paying attention. So to learn to listen well, paraphrase what's said to show that you're listening and to verify accuracy. This will also reduce the likelihood of conflict. Another way to listen better is to try to keep a mental checklist of the important points someone's making. And of course, always ask questions if you don't understand, or even to confirm that you understood. Also, providing clear information. Workplace communication also often involves passing information from one person to the next, right? And unclear or inaccurate communication can cause confusion instead of clarity. If we don't communicate the purpose and objective of our message, people likely won't understand what they need to do. So plan our communication to ensure what we're passing along is correct and also the right amount of information. And avoid emails that are written in haste, and always think before we speak. Next is recognizing good work. Employee recognition makes employees go the extra mile and builds trust between employees and managers. Recognition not only improves communication, but also employees who get recognized engage up to 60% more. And handle conflicts with diplomacy. Number 9, if you feel someone misunderstood something you communicated, talk with them about it as soon as possible. This can prevent unnecessary resentment and loss of productivity. We can prevent small misunderstandings from turning into a big crisis by handling it right away. I hope you guys hear my dog barking. We just talked about those distractions. Sorry about that. When handling a conflict, respond with an open mind and refrain from personal attacks. And finally, keep remote employees connected. Super important, especially now. We should develop a strategy on how to keep remote employees connected and how to make sure relevant information reaches them at the right time. And why is this so important? 20% of remote employees say they lack a sense of belonging and feel lonely. Next slide, please, David. So what are the common challenges to communication? The most common barrier is not listening. And there can be any number of reasons. Could be we're not involved in the topic and therefore we don't really care. Could be we have a different opinion and are focused on thinking about what we're going to say, or we could be distracted by things like my barking dog or any other noise in the office. Assumptions, we make assumptions to speed up a process or to make a quick decision. But by making assumptions, we're likely missing out on important information. Emotional distractions sometimes happen due to illness or not getting a good night's sleep or problems with family or friends. But when we're emotionally distracted, others might interpret that as we're angry or we're annoyed with them or it's something about them. So even if we're not feeling 100%, we need to try not to take that out on our dear colleagues. And finally, perception. Everyone thinks differently, and that's okay. So we need to keep in mind to be open to new ideas and new approaches. We may learn better ways in the process. Next slide, please. So what do we do when communication breaks down? Well, it's always helpful to get the facts, not our interpretations, not other people's interpretations. And by doing this, we engage our thinking brains and get back to our greater commitment to success of a project or a goal. It helps get us on the same page, and then we can focus on common ground and finding a solution. And we always want to listen to understand, not just to respond. In other words, practice active listening. I talked about this a little earlier, but it helps to restate what the other person is saying to ensure you're understanding and to show that you care about what they're saying. Empathize. You can express empathy and understanding without necessarily agreeing by saying something like, I understand how frustrated you must feel. And finally, of course, I'm going to recommend hiring a coach, but I practice what I preach. I have my own coach who helps me gain clarity so I can see the forest for the trees. A coach can help us understand our approach and our blind spots so we can be more effective. David, take it away.
Thank you, Gretchen. And I'm going into a totally different area. I'm going to talk about training. And I know this is not necessarily something that people want to hear, but there are still legal requirements in many jurisdictions, for example, in California, in New York, in Connecticut, where training is the law. You still must do your training. There's no pass because of the pandemic. But I think that what we do is we flip it. Instead of thinking, oh, God, we've got to train, why not look at it as it's a positive? It's something that's really good. It gives you a chance to get your team together. It gives you a chance to have your team interact with one another. And that's an important thing because as Gretchen was talking about, with people who are remote feeling isolated, if your team is together, they're feeling less isolated and more like a team. So I think it's an opportunity, not a burden, that companies should embrace. When training, whatever the topic, and I'm going to talk about management training, harassment prevention, and diversity and sensitivity during this webinar, but on all three, train on voice. People need to have a voice. Your employees have got to be able to speak up when something happens and know who they should be speaking to. And as you just heard, eloquently stated, listening is key. Employees and managers all can do a better job of listening. And then the R word, respect. When you train, in all training, please reinforce the need for your employees to speak up, to listen when others speak up, and treat one another with respect. And that's the great opportunity training presents, because it can be done in a way that's tailored to your team, and it can be interactive, and it can be so rewarding for so many reasons. Now, because of the pandemic and because of so many people working remotely, we've got more people working at home than ever before. But the policies that companies created pre-2020 pandemic were for a workforce usually where the vast majority of the employees are in the office. So what does that mean? That means the policies are talking about one work environment, and in reality, we're in a very different work environment. And some of our clients are updating their policies, which is really good. Update your policies, but I do think you need to disseminate the policy, get it out to the employees, and then talk about what's different. That's another form of training. Tell your team what's new, what's different. Let your employees know this is what, let's say a person's got a job title of X. This is what it looks like for X to be successful. Let your employees know. Train on that. And in every training that we put on, we embrace a company's core values. Why was that company formed? What does it want to be known as? And I think when LeiLani was talking about her business, Be the Change, I think it's remarkable what I've learned about her core values. She touched very, very briefly on philanthropy, or maybe I did in introducing her, but maybe when she speaks later, she could tell us a bit about some of the special work that she and her team do, because that's the core values. But think also about the mission that your organization has. So we've got a remote team, and because we've got a remote team, managers need to pick up the skills necessary to work remotely. And I don't want to repeat, a lot of what Gretchen was talking about, and LeiLani was also talking about with people working remotely. But the reality is, if you are cryptic in your messaging with employees, you create the risk of misunderstanding. Misunderstanding invariably leads to hard feelings, poor work, frustration, and a disengaged workforce. So in terms of training managers, one of the things that's really important is to give managers the toolkit to manage remotely. As an example, I did a training yesterday for one of my clients, and one of the things I talked about is when you have people working remotely and you've got people in the office, make sure that you spend as much time with the people who are remote as the people in the office. So, for example, if you have a morning conversation with the 2 or 3 people in the office, hold it by Zoom and include the people who are working remotely, but also have everybody in their own office during the conference. And I'm not talking about social distancing. I'm talking about having 2 or 3 people sitting around the conference room table and 1 or 2 people remote. The people who are remote are still going to feel that they're disengaged. And, again, because of the fact that the policies say one thing and reality says another, it's very important that the message that the employees are receiving from managers is not a mixed message. People management, you've all heard the expression, we don't manage just when giving out a performance evaluation. Management is a 12-month 52-week-a-year proposition. That doesn't change because of a pandemic. So we still need to give that feedback to the employees, as Amanda said, positive and also constructive, but we do need to give that feedback. And I couldn't agree more with the proposition the feedback should be done verbally, not in a cryptic email or a text message. And by the way, as an attorney who goes to court, I am not a fan of text messaging being a good form of communication in the workplace, because if an employee does bring an action claiming that they were treated unfairly, maybe in a disparate manner, and it's difficult to retrieve communication, some companies use a system like a Slack system, and I walk into court and I don't have a full file. And for those of you who remember a show from a long, long time ago called The Honeymooners, you really don't want me in front of a judge saying, humana, 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 because I don't have the information you need. We also want to make sure our managers mitigate legal risk. And one of the things you may want to write down is tracking time. When you're working with a remote workforce and you're sending text messages, you're calling, you're sending emails to a private email account, or they have their email on all the time, and you're doing this with non-exempt employees, and you send your message whenever you feel like it, all of a sudden your non-exempt employees are working more than 40 hours a week. You've got overtime risks. So there are a host of other legal risks that the managers need to understand. And then the last point in training the managers is to make as clear as humanly possible to the members of their team what are the expectations you have of people on the team. So let's talk about harassment prevention training. And news bulletin, news flash, hot off the presses. On Monday, June 15, 2020, the United States Supreme Court came down with a landmark decision, and that is that Title VII covers discrimination based upon race, religion, ethnicity, national origin, and sex. And its definition of sex includes protection for LGBTQ. This is huge for many reasons. Number one is no longer under federal law is it legal to impact the terms and conditions of a person's employment simply because of the person's sexual preference. And that's a big deal. But for harassment prevention training, it also means that it is illegal now to harass somebody because of LGBTQ status. So employers who do train, and people on the call, on the webinar who do train, take a look at your material. Are you training your employees that they cannot harass somebody because of LGBTQ status? It's a big deal. If you're not doing it, you've got to do it right away. I'm sorry to say, but that's huge. So why is training something that's legally required, in addition to the states that actually have it in statutes, like, for example, New York, Connecticut, and California, it is also the best practice. And this goes back to two Supreme Court cases that were decided together, Farragher and Ellerth. And what they said is, if you have a good employee manual with a complaint process, and you've trained your clients, your employees, excuse me, not your clients, but your employees, on your complaint mechanism, you have an affirmative defense in employee versus employee harassment. So that's a big deal. Another reason why training is so very important, and this is critical, why a couple of years ago, when #MeToo was in the news on a daily basis, why, even though the employment laws, the federal laws, go back to 1964, why in 2019 was #MeToo a big deal in the news all those years later? And that's after more than 20 years of training as required by the Supreme Court decisions and then in many states in their own state statutes. Why is it still a big deal? And the answer that many people have come up with is perception. What do the employees perceive? Do they believe that if an issue arises and they go to HR or to senior leadership with that issue, do they perceive that their issue will be addressed by the company in an appropriate manner? Or do they believe that if they go to HR or to senior management, they're committing career suicide? The problem is that according to the studies that came out in 2017, 2018, and 2019, the vast majority of people believed that it would be career suicide if they were to escalate, if they were the victim of harassment or they witnessed someone else being harassed. That was a perception. I did a program at the American Medical Association at their annual conference. I did a couple of programs, actually, and I surveyed the audience about whether they know somebody who complained of harassment. And, almost all the hands were up. Of the people who complained, and I was very cautious not to ask if they complained, but if they know someone who did. Of the people whose hands were up, 3/4 of them kept their hands up when I asked if that person who complained felt that they were the victim of retaliation because they complained. And that's a big part of the problem, is employee perception. So training now, especially at a time when it may be not a legal requirement, can help create the perception the company cares. It wants to be a great place to work. It wants to make this one of the top places in whatever community you're in for you to work. Social media has created more and more ways for people to harass one another. Unfortunately, when you have something like a pandemic, there is increased anxiety. And because of increased anxiety, people sometimes do things they would not otherwise do. And they're upset, they're scared, they lash out. And that is something that people can do with their coworkers. And it's an increased problem. So one of the things you want to do is get out in front of the risk that coworkers are going to treat one another inappropriately and even harass them, during this time of a pandemic. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was diversity and sensitivity. And we have all heard in the news what's going on. And like harassment and #MeToo, the federal laws go way back. And in fact, the federal laws regarding racism go back to just after the Civil War, when they passed 1981. So let's talk a bit about what's going on, and that's implicit bias. And you heard a bit about implicit bias earlier in the program today. What is that? That's the reality that people in their mind prejudge other people. I have implicit bias. My colleagues on this panel, terrific as they are, all have implicit bias. The question is, what do you do about your implicit bias? And it took a while, but the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission finally changed its approach. It told us to train that people should not recognize other people's differences. So I should really walk in a room and not notice Amanda, LeiLani, and Gretchen are female. I should not have noticed that. That's what the EEOC wanted us to do. Poppycock. That's a nice legal term. The reality is we do notice differences. The question is, can we avoid making employment decisions affecting terms and conditions of employment? Can we avoid ostracizing others because of our implicit bias? Think of the expression, it's great to be invited to the party. We all want to get invited to the party. We want to be that person that Amanda successfully recruits into a company that's got, LeiLani doing his HR work and Gretchen doing the coaching. We all want that job. But even better, we want to be asked to dance. What does that mean? We want to be included. We want to have a room to grow in that company. So when we do train on diversity and sensitivity, we do need to talk about the elephant in the room. That is, we all have bias, and how do we get around that? Now, there are all kinds of benefits to doing diversity and sensitivity training right now. Internally, you want to let your employees know, and this goes back to that word perception. You want to let your employees know you care, and you want this to be a great place. You want your teams to work well together, and it's not advisable to simply pretend that we don't have things going on right now that are affecting people at home, people in and about town, and people at work. So internally, our team needs to be strong. And by training on diversity and sensitivity, we can help ensure that our team is strong. Externally, we've got brand. We want people to see our brand as being a brand that's inclusive, where we do things in a way that's right, just, moral, and ethical. And then obviously there's the legal benefit to doing the training to get out ahead of the risks of any kinds of problems that companies will have. Keep in mind, when you do think about doing diversity and sensitivity training, it's extraordinarily important for you to make sure that when you train, it's not a one and done. Your training is one step in a process. Spend some time putting together a bunch of action items in addition to a training to ensure that you've got an environment free from any form of racism and any other types of discrimination. With that, Amanda, I understand that you had a question that you wanted to ask.
I do. I have a question for LeiLani. Given all the tough news we have these days, from asking employees to return to work, to layoffs, to the most recent protests for Black Lives Matter, what's the best way to communicate and talk to our employees? As a leader, I'm completely at a loss.
Oh, it's a great question. It's tough to be a leader right now. All eyes are on you. Your employees are looking at, what your next move is. What is the company going to do? Recently, I had an executive director of a large nonprofit call me and talk to me about everything she had been doing in support of Black Lives Matter. And she felt like it wasn't enough. And she felt like her employees, they weren't happy with what they were doing. And they were, they had some large meetings. They were donating money to different causes. And so we shared ideas about how to support Black men and women in her organization and beyond. And then our discussion really came down to this. It came down to treating the employees with care, with love, with openness. Also, you know, she has a large organization, so the town hall meetings, smaller groups, so she could really listen, and then a plan of action, and then communicating what the company will be doing next. Like David talked about, one way to make sure your organization is trained is to do the harassment training, diversity inclusion training, sensitivity training, and then also having that follow-up, again, like David talked about, which is very, very important. So we talked about that too. And then finally, as a leader, I told herself just to give her some grace because we can't do it all and we can't please all. It reminds me of this meme. There's a taco on it, and it says, "You can't make everyone happy. You're not a taco." So make sure that you give a little bit of grace to yourself in this process as well. We're doing all we can. I have a question for Gretchen. Gretchen, I know a lot of companies are hurting and are concerned about their forecast. Should that have an impact on engaging a coach?
Oh, thanks for that question. Actually, that's even more of a reason to bring in a coach because during difficult times, we tend to lose clarity. And a coach helps increase clarity, which leads to better increased efficiency and ultimately improves our profitability. You know, in times of change, there's usually new opportunities we may or may not see, but a coach can help identify them and make the best of those opportunities. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have a question for David. David, what do you say to companies who tell you that they are not going to conduct training because of the cost, or that most, if not all, of their employees are remote?
Thank you, Gretchen. Because of the pandemic, the courts have slowed down. It doesn't mean that cases are still being litigated. Recently, there was a $3 million judgment that was reached on one case involving harassment. There was a case involving Dollar General I wanted to talk about real quickly. And this took place down in Tennessee, I believe. And it was a diabetic on insulin. And the diabetic asked for an accommodation, worked in the store, and wanted to be able to have some kind of sweet substance in case she had a low blood sugar. She had spikes in her blood sugar, highs and lows, and wanted to have something with her. Her boss said, "No, you can't have it." She gets a low blood sugar. She drinks an orange juice that she took from the cooler, drank it, paid. I think it cost $1.83. She paid the $1.83, and loss prevention and her manager come in a week later, and they fire her. If the manager had been properly trained, the manager would have said to HR, "Hey, I got this request by a diabetic for an accommodation. What should I do?" And the manager would say, "That's a reasonable accommodation. Let her do that." Instead, the request was denied. The manager was fired. It went to the Circuit Court of Appeals, judgment in favor of the former employee for $275,000 plus her legal fees, plus the legal fees to defend the case cost more than $750,000 and some pretty negative publicity for Dollar General. So that's just a really good reminder for people. Hey, Amanda, I don't want you to feel left out. Here's a question I have for you. Communication with employees through all stages, including recruiting and layoffs, is extra complex right now with the pandemic and legacy of racism in our country. What is the one thing employers can do to effectively communicate?
You know, I'm going to say one thing in a handful of different ways so people can really choose which makes the most sense to them. You know, we are all one. We are all dealing with the same issues. No matter how these different issues feel to you, you know, everyone in our country and our world is dealing with the issues that have been discussed today. And so I think if we all can continue to think of candidates and employees as walking billboards, as customers, as human beings, these are people that need to be treated fairly and kindly. And we all just need to be very sensitive to what is going on. We should always be kind and sensitive to various issues in the world, but especially right now, I think it's extremely important. So remember, past, present, and potential employees. They're all should be considered customers. Thanks, David.
Thank you all. And, I think we all wanted to say a quick something, but we all did this because we want to help all of you to best run your businesses and your lives during these crazy times. And we all would be happy to speak to you if you want to reach out to us, but thank you all. Gretchen, if you wanted to say hello.
Hello, thank you.
LeiLani.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody.
And Amanda, I'm not going to leave you out again.
Yeah, this has been great. I encourage all of you to reach out to me or any of my incredible co-presenters. As you can see, there's a ton of knowledge here, and we're all happy to help you get through this interesting time in our history.
Thank you all very much.
Well said. Interesting.